I do think, you know, one of the things I thought was interesting was when you were talking about the difficulty describing Christian nationalism or defining it well, which I think was a good part of the conversation, because anyone who's writing about this or making a documentary about it, like, that's one of the challenges. And I do think part of what you were there was a couple different places where they were coming up with, like, here's really what defines it. And I appreciate that you were pushing them on the question of, is it just Christians advocating for Christian things in public? Because I do think this is one of the challenges when an academic term like Christian nationalism, which started as an academic term, it's similar to like critical race theory, starts as an academic term. When it starts getting used out in public, sometimes people use it in really messy ways. And I do think sometimes Christian nationalist has turned into just like a catch-all phrase. Yes. And so I appreciated hearing them even kind of like work out with you, like, where are the limits of this? What counts and what doesn't? And I do think one important point of it was when they got to the point of saying it's not who advocates based on their deeply held religious convictions. And I thought it was great how you pulled out, that's what everyone is doing. No one is making just purely rational judgments about things. It's when people use violence to get it, or they think that their position as a Christian, because of their history of America as a Christian nation, should count more. And it reminds me of, there was a Pew study in 2020 that a bunch of people posted about that basically said like 60% or something of evangelicals think that the Bible should supersede the will of the people in America. And people were like, oh, this is terrible, it's Christian nationalist. And that could be true to a certain extent. It was also true that like half of Black Protestants said the same thing, that the Bible should take precedence over the will of the people. And it's one of the reasons why some of those studies can't really capture, I think, what's going on, because there are plenty of people who think, hey, there are some principles of the inherent dignity and value of all humans that I don't think you can get apart from the Christian tradition. They don't come from nowhere. They're not obviously true, rational things. They really do come as gifts to us from the Christian tradition. That truth should supersede the will of the people. If 60% of Americans think we should kill all of a certain subset of the population, no, the will of the people should not trump this inherent belief we have in the dignity and value of all humans. But the difference there is not just like what the Bible should trump versus the people. It's, do you think whatever your interpretation of the Bible is should be enacted through violence against people who don't agree with you? That's something that we live in a country where we have said we have rational disagreements. We use the will of the people on certain things. We have constitutional protections where we can't let the will of the people supersede the rights of individuals. But most importantly, we don't use violence to get the things that we want, that we have religious or non-religious motivations for. And getting to that point in the interview, I thought was really important to distinguish for people. It really is not Christian nationalist for you to have deeply held Christian or other religious reasons for the things that you're voting for, like you talked about. But the voting part's really important. You voting is different than you physically coercing your neighbor to hold to Christian beliefs.
I think two things. One, you're right, Caitlin. Like, some people on the left are using Christian nationalism, that phrase, as a catch-all for everything they don't like coming from religious believers on the conservative end of the spectrum. It feels a little bit like the way some advocates on the right end of the spectrum use CRT and woke as a catch-all for everything they don't like from progressives on the left. And that's not fair. Both are an overuse of the term. However, I do think, obviously using physical violence and force to push your agenda is a problem. And Christian nationalists who do that, that's a step too far. But I wouldn't draw the line at violence or physical
That's
coercion,
not the only
right?
part. Yeah.
Right. So I think there are plenty of Christian nationalists who are not resorting to violence, but who nonetheless have given up on the value of persuasion.
Yeah.
And part of our Christian beliefs, as you were saying, is the dignity of all human beings. And part of that Christian value means that I respect my neighbors who disagree with me, and I respect them enough to not force my beliefs and values upon them, even as I try to persuade them. And I can try to persuade them in the political realm, in the voting booth, in the public square, in the schools, whatever. I can try to persuade my neighbors to agree with my point of view. The problem with Christian nationalism is it gives up on persuasion. And it says, I am going to instill these quote unquote Christian or biblical values upon everyone else, whether they want them or not, maybe through physical force, maybe by suppressing their ability to vote, maybe by just erasing their freedom of speech or whatever it might be. But I get to win because I'm a Christian. not I get to win because I love my neighbors into persuading them that my view is the most persuasive.
Right.
That's the problem.
I think overturning Roe is a good example of that, because some Christians were advocating for, no, we just need to keep persuading. Let's keep persuading because it's actually working. Abortion rates are falling steadily as the decades go by. And other Christians were saying, no, this is wrong. It's wrong. The Bible says it's wrong. I say it's wrong. We need to make it wrong. And by kind of pulling the levers of democracy in a slightly, and I'm speaking specifically about giving Trump an extra Supreme Court nominee, one more than he really should have had. But we did it because the ends will justify the means. And now we'll have a conservative court that can overturn Roe. And since then, partly because we snuck around the will of the people to make this happen, the will of the people is actually shifting more against pro-life causes. And more in a pro-choice direction. So, which is what happened when Roe was passed in the first place. It wasn't the will of the people that we have suddenly legal abortion up until viability across the whole nation. And it sparked this revolution, that has, in essence, led us to where we are now, trying to push it back.
I agree. I also think part of what makes the abortion question somewhat helpful in clarifying what we're thinking about here is, like I said before, it is true that a lot of our kind of basic protections, the Bill of Rights, that comes out of this sense of the kind of basic dignity and humanity of every person, this like equality that we have not lived up to in our history, absolutely not, but comes out of like Christian ideals that were really new in the world. We don't think that we should just persuade people about those. Those are non-negotiables. Like, we're not trying to persuade people that every person has, inherent dignity and value in opposition to, no, there are laws that protect them. Like, this is what we believe. And there are certain things about individuals that you can't harm or infringe them in these ways because of what we believe about them. And I think the abortion one is so tricky because it shows that it's really hard to find where the line is between the things that we go, this is not up for debate. This is not something we persuade on. This is something we legislate because it's just true and important. And we can't have absolutely everything be up for debate. But then there are a lot of things that really are. And especially when you're talking about these ideas that, again, don't come from nowhere, are distinctly Christian ideas. And we've tried to unmoor them from those Christian, bases. But then we suddenly forget that, how do we make decisions then about what counts as something that we persuade and what doesn't? I don't know if y'all have been listening to Justin Brierley's The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God podcast. It's incredible. Yes, I mean, props to him. It's like a really well done podcast. And a lot of it is not only him talking about the people who are, former atheists or people who were, kind of in the academic atheist world coming to faith in God. But a lot of what he's talking about is people who are starting to realize that a lot of their ethical assumptions come out of Christianity. And they didn't realize that until they tried to separate themselves from Christianity and then realized, I don't actually have a good intellectually honest basis for these beliefs I have about human beings and what's right and wrong. And a lot of that, I think, ties into the Christian nationalism conversation, because to the point of the more, flirting with Christian nationalism people, they're wondering, where is the line? Like, where do I go? This is a deeply held Christian belief that I don't just think should inform my personal life. I think this is important for a community to function well. And when is it, no, actually, this is just a personal belief. It shouldn't inform all of communal life. Or even if it should inform communal life, it shouldn't be something like the Bill of Rights that we don't fight about. It should be something we have to persuade each other on and actually work out together. Making decisions about that is not obvious. And part of the reason I think it's so hard to define Christian nationalism is because those lines are not obvious. They're really difficult, especially when some of those initial conversations we had about what counted as negotiable and what wasn't existed in a world where even if it wasn't true that everyone was a Christian, we sort of acted like everyone was, or we could argue on that basis. And now that we can't, we don't know what basis to argue for those things on.
Right.